The first merchant to return to the empty marketplace arrived just before dawn, his cartwheels creaking through streets that had known only silence for months, the sound echoing off shuttered windows and barred doors like a tentative question asked of the darkness. He had traveled through the night from a village 15 miles distant, driven by rumors that the pestilence had finally released its grip on the city, that the dying had stopped, that life might be possible again in these cobblestone lanes where death had reigned supreme through the terrible summer and autumn of the plague year. As he unhitched his horse in the gray pre-dawn light, he could see no movement, hear no voices, sense no life in the buildings that rose around him like the walls of a tomb. But he had come with goods to sell, apples from his orchard, cheese from his dairy, hope wrapped in the ordinary commerce of living, and he would wait to see if anyone remained to buy them. What he could not know, as he arranged his wares on the wooden planks of his cart and watched the sun rise over a city that seemed more graveyard than home, was that his simple act of faith would mark a beginning, that within hours others would join him, that within days the marketplace would live again, and that he stood at the threshold of a transformation so profound that the world he had known before the plague would never return, replaced by something stranger, more terrible in some ways, more wonderful in others, but undeniably and irreversibly new. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The recovery began in fragments, in isolated acts of courage and stubborn hope scattered across a continent that had been brought to its knees by the greatest catastrophe in recorded history. In a monastery in southern France, 3 monks who had survived when 40 of their brothers died emerged from their cells and began the work of burying the dead, a task that took them weeks, their spades breaking the frozen earth of late autumn to lay their brothers to rest, with whatever dignity they could manage. In a village in England, a woman named Margaret stood in the doorway of her cottage and looked out at fields gone, to seed at houses standing empty, at a landscape suddenly vast and lonely, and made the decision to stay, rather than flee to plant again in the spring, to rebuild what had been lost even though she had lost her husband and 3 of her 4 children to the pestilence. These small acts of persistence, multiplied across thousands of communities, formed the foundation of recovery. The plague had not destroyed the physical infrastructure of European civilization. The fields remained, the buildings stood, the tools and equipment that people had used to make their living survived even when their owners did not. What had been destroyed was the human fabric, the web of relationships and obligations and knowledge that made society function. Rebuilding that fabric would require not just time, but transformation, because there were simply too few people left to recreate the world exactly as it had been. In the immediate aftermath of the plague's first devastating wave, which swept across Europe between 1347 and 1353, the survivors faced challenges that seemed almost insurmountable. The most basic tasks of daily life became complicated when so many hands were missing. A mill that had required 3 men to operate now had only 1 survivor, who struggled to grind grain for a community that had once numbered in the hundreds, but now counted its inhabitants in dozens. A blacksmith who had learned his trade from his father and had been teaching it to his 2 sons found himself alone in his shop, his father and sons all dead, with no one to work the bellows or help him at the forge. A midwife who had delivered babies in her village for 30 years discovered that most of the young women she had attended were gone, and the few who remained were often too traumatized or too ill to conceive. The shortage of skilled workers affected every aspect of life. When tools broke, there might be no one left who knew how to repair them. When buildings needed maintenance, the craftsmen who had possessed the necessary skills might all be dead. When disputes arose that required legal knowledge, the lawyers and clerks who might have resolved them might have perished. The accumulated expertise of generations, passed down through apprenticeships and family traditions, had been partially erased, creating gaps in knowledge that would take years or decades to fill. Yet necessity drove innovation and adaptation in ways that would have been impossible in the crowded world before the plague. A young man who might have spent 7 years as an apprentice learning a trade now found himself thrust into mastery after only a year or two, learning through trial and error what would once have been taught through careful instruction. A woman who would never have been permitted to take up her dead husband's trade now did so out of sheer necessity, and often proved as capable as any man. Children were pressed into adult responsibilities years before they would have been in the old world, growing up fast in a society that desperately needed every pair of hands. The economic dislocations were profound and immediate. In the first years after the plague, prices behaved erratically as the basic mechanisms of supply and demand struggled to adjust to the new reality. Food prices initially fell because there were fewer mouths to feed, even though agricultural production had also declined dramatically. Manufactured goods became expensive because the craftsmen who made them were scarce. Land values collapsed because property that had once been precious now stood abandoned, with no one to claim it or work it. Wages for those who labored soared because workers were desperately needed and could command almost any price. The attempts by authorities to control these economic changes through legislation revealed both the magnitude of the transformation and the limits of governmental power. The English Statute of Labourers of 1351 tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from seeking better opportunities, but it failed almost immediately because landlords desperate to get their crops harvested would pay whatever was necessary regardless of what the law said. Similar ordinances in France and the Italian city-states and the kingdoms of Iberia all met with similar failure. The economic forces unleashed by the plague were too powerful to be contained by legal pronouncements. For those who survived, particularly those of the laboring classes, the post-plague world offered opportunities that would have been unimaginable before the catastrophe. A peasant who had worked the same small plot of land for his entire life, bound by custom and law to serve his lord, might now find himself with the leverage to negotiate better terms, or even to walk away and claim abandoned land elsewhere. A craftsman who had labored in obscurity under the direction of a guildmaster might now be able to set up his own shop and attract customers who had no other options. A servant who had earned barely enough to survive might now command wages that allowed not just subsistence, but the accumulation of savings and the purchase of goods that had once been luxuries. The redistribution of wealth that occurred in the years after the plague was dramatic and far-reaching. The survivors inherited the possessions of the dead, their clothes, their tools, their furniture, their livestock, their land. In many cases, these inheritances came from multiple sources as people found themselves the sole survivors of extended families. A woman might inherit from her parents her siblings, her husband, and her children all in the space of a few months, suddenly finding herself in possession of property and goods far beyond what she could have hoped to accumulate in a lifetime of work in the old world. A young man might become the master of an estate because he was the only male relative left alive, inheriting responsibilities and resources that would never have been his before the plague. This sudden abundance of material goods per capita had profound psychological effects. For the first time in living memory, scarcity was not the dominant fact of economic life for most people. There was enough. There was more than enough. The houses stood empty but furnished. The fields lay fallow but fertile. The shops held goods but lacked customers. This experience of abundance, even in the midst of grief and loss, began to reshape how people thought about their lives and their possibilities. The church struggled to make sense of the catastrophe and to maintain its authority in the face of theological challenges posed by the plague. If God was all-powerful and all-good, why had he allowed such suffering? If prayer and penance were effective, why had they failed to halt the pestilence? If the clergy were specially favored by God, why had they died in such numbers? These questions, asked in thousands of conversations and hundreds of sermons, had no easy answers. The official position, that the plague had been divine punishment for sin, and that survivors should reform their lives and return to righteousness, satisfied some, but rang hollow to many others who had seen the righteous perish alongside the wicked, the devout die alongside the sinful. The quality of the clergy declined in the years immediately after the plague because the church, desperate to replace its losses, ordained men who would not have been acceptable before. The careful training and rigorous selection that had characterized the pre-plague church gave way to hasty ordinations of barely educated candidates. Parish priests who could barely read Latin celebrated masses they did not fully understand. Bishops appointed to replace the learned prelates who had died proved more interested in enriching themselves than in shepherding their flocks. The gap between the ideals of the church and the reality of its clergy widened, creating space for criticism and reform movements that would eventually challenge the institution itself. Yet despite these problems, or perhaps because of them, popular piety flourished in the post-plague period. People sought meaning and comfort in religion even as they questioned religious authority. The cult of the saints expanded as people sought intercessors who might protect them from future outbreaks of disease. The veneration of the Virgin Mary intensified, her role as a merciful mother appealing to people who had experienced so much loss. New forms of devotion emerged, emphasizing direct emotional connection to the divine rather than the mediation of the institutional church. The late medieval religious sensibility, with its focus on the humanity of Christ, the sorrows of Mary, and the accessibility of the saints, was shaped in large part by the experiences of the plague years. In the months and years after the worst of the pestilence had passed, communities had to decide what to do with the physical remnants of the catastrophe. The dead had been buried, often hastily and with minimal ceremony, in mass graves that scarred the landscape around every town and village. Churches stood half empty, their congregations decimated, houses stood vacant, their doors open, their contents slowly deteriorating. Fields that had been carefully cultivated for centuries were reverting to wilderness as nature reclaimed what human hands no longer tended. The question facing survivors was whether to try to restore everything that had been lost, or to accept that some things were gone forever and adapt to a new reality. Different communities made different choices. Some villages, reduced to just a handful of inhabitants, were abandoned entirely, their survivors moving to join other communities or to establish themselves on better land that had become available. The landscape of late medieval Europe is dotted with the sites of these deserted villages, identifiable today only by subtle variations in the terrain and the occasional fragment of worked stone. Other communities, despite devastating losses, chose to remain and rebuild, driven by attachment to place, by the presence of good land or strategic location, or simply by their determination not to let their home die. In the cities, the challenges were different, but no less profound. Urban centers had suffered terribly during the plague, their dense populations providing ideal conditions for the disease to spread. In some cities, mortality rates exceeded 60%. The survivors faced the question of how to reorganize urban life with drastically reduced populations. Neighborhoods stood empty. Guilds that had once had hundreds of members now counted their survivors in dozens. Markets that had bustled with activity now echoed with emptiness. Churches that had been built to serve thousands now held congregations of hundreds. Yet the cities also proved remarkably resilient. The advantages that had led to their founding, access to trade routes, defensible positions, productive hinterlands, remained even after the plague. Within a few years, migration from the countryside began to replenish urban populations as people sought the opportunities that cities offered. This migration was selective, drawing the ambitious, the skilled, and the desperate to urban centers, creating a demographic mix different from what had existed before the plague. The governance of cities had to adapt to new realities. Guild regulations that had carefully controlled who could practice which trades and under what conditions became impossible to enforce when there were too few skilled workers to meet demand. Guilds that had excluded outsiders now had to accept them. Trades that had been hereditary now had to recruit from outside family lines. Women, who had been formally excluded from most guild activities, found themselves grudgingly accepted when there was no one else to do the work. These changes, made reluctantly and under pressure of necessity, created precedents that would gradually erode the restrictive practices of the guild system. The physical reconstruction of cities proceeded slowly but steadily. Buildings that had been damaged during the plague years were repaired. Empty houses were reoccupied or torn down and their materials reused. Streets that had become impassable were cleared. The improved economic circumstances of survivors meant that reconstruction often involved upgrading and improvement rather than simple restoration. A craftsman who inherited a modest house might use his increased earnings to expand it or improve its construction. A merchant who had prospered by selling goods to the reduced but wealthier population might build a more imposing shop and warehouse. The late 14th century city, while smaller in population than its pre-plague predecessor, was often better built and more comfortable. The question of how to remember the dead and commemorate the catastrophe produced a variety of responses. Some communities erected monuments or chapels dedicated to plague victims. Many established masses to be said in perpetuity for the souls of those who had died. Guilds and confraternities commissioned artworks depicting the plague or its aftermath. The theme of the Dance of Death, skeletal figures leading representatives of all social classes to the grave, became popular in art and literature, a reminder that death came for everyone regardless of rank or wealth or virtue. But commemoration was complicated by the magnitude of the loss. How does one memorialize millions of dead? How does one create meaning from catastrophe on such a scale? Many communities simply tried to move forward, to focus on the living rather than dwelling on the dead. The impulse was understandable but created a kind of collective amnesia, a desire to forget the trauma, even as its effects continued to shape daily life. The plague became something people referred to obliquely, a great mortality that had occurred, a time of dying now past rather than something to be examined or analyzed or fully acknowledged. The agricultural landscape underwent dramatic transformation in the decades after the plague. The shortage of labor made it impossible to cultivate all the land that had been farmed before the catastrophe. Landlords had to make choices about which fields to maintain and which to abandon. Generally, they chose to focus on the best land, the most productive fields, and let marginal land revert to pasture or woodland. This process, driven by economic necessity, actually improved agricultural efficiency in the long run. The labor that remained was concentrated on the most fertile soil, producing better yields per worker even as total production declined. The shift from arable farming to pastoral agriculture accelerated in many regions. Sheep farming, which required far less labor than grain cultivation, became increasingly attractive to landlords facing high labor costs. In England, this shift would eventually transform the landscape, creating the enclosed pastures and sheep walks that would characterize much of the countryside. The wool trade, already important before the plague, became even more central to the English economy. Similar shifts occurred in other regions, in Castile, in the Low Countries, wherever the economics of pastoral farming made sense in the post-plague world. For peasants who remained on the land, the changes often brought substantial benefits. With less land under cultivation and fewer people to feed, holdings tended to be larger. A family that had struggled to survive on a few acres before the plague might now work 10 or 15 acres, producing substantial surpluses they could sell in the market. The soil, having lain fallow in many areas for several years, was rested and fertile, producing good yields when it was brought back into cultivation. The combination of larger holdings, better land, and improved terms from landlords created a standard of living for peasants that exceeded anything their ancestors had known. The improvement in diet was particularly significant. Before the plague, most peasants had subsisted primarily on bread, porridge, and ale, with occasional supplements of vegetables, cheese, and very rarely meat. After the plague, with grain cheap and livestock relatively abundant, meat consumption increased dramatically. Archaeological analysis of bones from cesspits and refuse heaps shows a marked increase in the proportion of animal bones from the late 14th century, evidence of much higher meat consumption. People ate more beef, pork, mutton, chicken, and fish. They consumed more butter, cheese, and eggs. The overall caloric intake improved, but more importantly, the quality of nutrition became much better, with adequate protein and fat supplementing the grain-heavy diet of earlier times. The improvement in housing was equally notable. Peasant houses before the plague had often been crude structures, single rooms with earthen floors, thatched roofs, walls of wattle and daub, minimal furniture, no chimneys. In the decades after the plague, peasant housing improved substantially. Stone or brick began to replace wattle and daub in areas where these materials were available. Chimneys became standard, allowing for proper hearths that made houses warmer and less smoky. Houses expanded to multiple rooms, with separate spaces for different functions. Windows, once rare in peasant dwellings, became common. Furniture proliferated. Proper beds, tables, chairs, chests for storage. These improvements were not universal or immediate, and they varied greatly by region and by the economic success of individual families. But the overall trend was clear. The material circumstances of ordinary people improved substantially in the century after the plague. This improvement was visible, documented in tax records, wills, and inventories that show peasants owning goods that would have been beyond the reach of their grandparents. A peasant household in 1400 might own several changes of clothes, metal rather than wooden cookware, glazed pottery glass vessels, decorative items, books, if the family was literate, and a variety of tools and equipment for work and household tasks. The psychological impact of this material improvement was profound. For the first time in memory, most people could expect not just to survive, but to live with some degree of comfort. The constant grinding poverty that had characterized peasant life for centuries began to ease. People had margin in their lives, savings, surplus goods, time that was not entirely consumed by the struggle for subsistence. This margin created space for other activities, for education, for cultural participation, for civic engagement, for thinking about the future rather than just surviving the present. The transformation of the urban economy created similar opportunities for townspeople. The guilds, which had carefully regulated urban crafts before the plague, found their control eroding as the shortage of skilled workers gave craftsmen leverage to negotiate better terms and even to work outside guild structures. The proliferation of small workshops run by masters who had risen to independence earlier than would have been possible before the plague created a more dynamic and competitive urban economy. Prices for manufactured goods remained relatively high, allowing craftsmen to prosper even as agricultural prices fell. The expansion of trade, both local and long distance, created opportunities for merchants and for the financial services that supported commerce. The increased wealth of the population meant more demand for goods beyond basic necessities. People wanted better cloth, finer pottery, imported spices, decorative items, books, art. The luxury trades flourished, and with them the merchants who imported exotic goods and the craftsmen who created high-quality wares. Banking and credit facilities expanded to support this trade, with Italian banking houses establishing branches across Europe and developing sophisticated financial instruments. The late medieval city was in many ways a more vibrant and diverse place than its pre-plague predecessor. The survivors and the migrants who joined them brought different skills, different traditions, different ideas. The weakening of guild controls allowed for more innovation and experimentation in craft production. The increased wealth supported a richer cultural life, more elaborate festivals, more public art, more musical performances, more theatrical presentations. Urban life, while still constrained by medieval standards, offered more variety and more possibility than it had before the catastrophe. Education expanded in response to both necessity and opportunity. The plague had killed large numbers of educated people: priests, lawyers, notaries, teachers, physicians. The need to replace them created demand for educational institutions. At the same time, the increased wealth of survivors meant that more families could afford to educate their children. The result was a proliferation of schools and a broadening of access to education. Universities, which had existed since the 12th century, but had been relatively small and exclusive, expanded in the late 14th and 15th centuries. New universities were founded in cities that had lacked them: Prague, Vienna, Heidelberg, St. Andrews, and many others. Existing universities grew in size. The student body became more socially diverse as the sons of merchants and prosperous peasants joined the sons of nobility and clergy who had dominated university education before the plague. This expansion created a larger educated class, people with Latin literacy and exposure to the traditional curriculum of logic, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology. Below the university level, grammar schools multiplied. These schools, which taught boys Latin grammar and basic literacy, had existed before the plague, but had been relatively rare. In the late 14th and 15th centuries, they became much more common, particularly in England and the German lands. Many were endowed by wealthy merchants or successful guildsmen who saw education as both a pious act and a practical investment in their community. The spread of grammar schools meant that literacy, while still limited to a minority, became more widespread than it had been. The expansion of education for girls and women was more limited but still significant. While universities remained closed to women, some wealthy families began to provide their daughters with education in literacy, languages, and practical skills. Convents, which had always offered some education to girls who were destined for religious life, expanded their educational mission in some cases to include girls from wealthy families who were not necessarily intended for the veil. The overall result was a modest but real increase in female literacy and education. The growth of literacy both drove and was driven by the expansion of written culture. More books were produced, both manuscript copies and, after the invention of printing in the mid-15th century, printed volumes. The subjects of books diversified beyond the religious and scholarly works that had dominated medieval literary production. Practical manuals on agriculture, crafts, medicine, and law became more common. Works of literature in vernacular languages, Italian, French, English, German, Spanish, proliferated. The book, once a rare and precious object, owned only by institutions or the very wealthy, became increasingly common in the households of prosperous merchants and even successful craftsmen. The development of vernacular literature was particularly significant for cultural and social change. Writing in the vernacular rather than in Latin made texts accessible to people who had not received a classical education. It also validated the vernacular languages, treating them as worthy vehicles for serious literature rather than as merely spoken dialects inferior to Latin. The great works of late medieval literature, Dante's Divine Comedy, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the chivalric romances, the mystery plays, were written in languages ordinary people could understand, creating a common culture that crossed the boundaries between educated and uneducated clerical and lay. This vernacular culture was more diverse and more democratic than the Latin culture it supplemented. A merchant who could read Italian or French or English might not be able to parse a Latin philosophical text, but he could enjoy the Decameron or the Romance of the Rose. A woman who had no access to formal education might still hear mystery plays performed in her town, or listen to romances read aloud. The expansion of vernacular culture created shared reference points and common stories that helped to knit together communities fractured by the plague years. The arts flourished in the post-plague period, supported by the wealth of survivors and driven by a complex mix of motivations: piety, commemoration, display of status, love of beauty, and perhaps a heightened appreciation for life born of proximity to death. Churches were rebuilt and decorated with new altarpieces, stained glass, sculptures, and frescoes. Wealthy individuals commissioned artworks for their private chapels or homes. Civic authorities funded public art that celebrated their city's wealth and importance. The demand for art was high, and artists who could meet that demand found themselves well compensated and highly regarded. In Italy, the late 14th and early 15th centuries saw the early stirrings of what would become the Renaissance. Artists like Giotto, who had died just before the plague, had pioneered more naturalistic styles of painting, breaking with the flat, stylized forms of earlier medieval art. His successors continued to develop these innovations, creating works that showed increasing attention to perspective, to anatomy, to the depiction of emotion and individual character. The wealthy cities of Italy, Florence, Siena, Venice, Milan, competed to attract the best artists, creating an environment where innovation was rewarded and excellence celebrated. In Northern Europe, the late Gothic style reached extraordinary heights of elaboration and technical virtuosity. Churches featured soaring vaults, enormous windows of stained glass, intricate stone carving, and rich decoration. Civic buildings were constructed with a grandeur that rivaled religious architecture, proclaiming the wealth and pride of urban communities. The great town halls of Flanders, the guild halls of German cities, the merchant palaces of Italian city-states, all testified to the prosperity and self-confidence of the post-plague urban world. The production of illuminated manuscripts became a major industry in cities like Paris, Bruges, and Gand. Wealthy patrons commissioned books of hours, psalters, and other devotional texts decorated with miniature paintings of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship. The Très Riche Heures, created by the Limbourg brothers for the Duke of Berry in the early 15th century, represents perhaps the pinnacle of this art form. A prayer book whose illustrations offer a vivid and detailed picture of aristocratic life and seasonal activities executed with technical brilliance and artistic sensitivity. Music also flourished in the post-plague period. The development of polyphony, music with multiple independent melodic lines, accelerated in the late 14th and 15th centuries. Composers working in the Burgundian court and in Italian cities created increasingly complex and sophisticated musical works for both sacred and secular contexts. The expansion of education meant more people could read musical notation, and the wealth of the period supported the employment of musicians at courts, in churches, and even in wealthy households. Music, like other arts, became more accessible and more central to cultural life. The recovery from the plague was not linear or uniform. The disease returned in waves throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, though never with the devastating mortality of the initial outbreak. These later epidemics, occurring in 1361-62, 1369-1374, 75, and at irregular intervals thereafter, killed thousands but not millions. They prevented rapid population recovery and kept demographic pressure low, which in turn maintained the relatively favorable economic conditions for workers and peasants. Each outbreak brought renewed fear and trauma, reminding people that the plague had not truly departed but only retreated, ready to return whenever conditions permitted. The recurring nature of the plague shaped the psychological landscape of the late medieval period. People lived with the knowledge that the disease might return at any time, that death could come suddenly and without warning. This awareness produced a complex response. On one hand, an intensified piety and concern with death and salvation; on the other hand, a determination to enjoy life while it lasted. The literature and art of the period reflect this tension, moving between meditations on mortality and celebrations of earthly pleasures, between warnings of divine judgment and delight in human creativity and achievement. The social tensions created by the post-plague transformations occasionally erupted into violence. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 saw tens of thousands of workers and peasants march on London, demanding the end of serfdom, reduction of taxes, and punishment of corrupt officials. The revolt was sparked by a poll tax that fell heavily on ordinary people, but its deeper causes lay in the changed relationship between landlords and laborers created by the plague. Peasants who had tasted freedom and prosperity were unwilling to accept attempts to reimpose the old order. The revolt was crushed, its leaders executed, but the trajectory of social change continued nonetheless. Similar uprisings occurred elsewhere. The Ciompi revolt in Florence in 1378, the Jacquerie in France in 1358, numerous smaller disturbances in German cities and the Low Countries. These revolts were not directly caused by the plague, but they reflected the social instability and changing power relationships that the plague had accelerated. They demonstrated that the traditional social order could not simply be restored by force, that the changes wrought by the catastrophe were too profound to be easily reversed. Yet alongside the conflict and tension, there was also remarkable creativity and energy. The late 14th and early 15th centuries saw significant advances in technology, though these were often incremental improvements rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Watermills were adapted for new purposes beyond grinding grain, for fulling cloth, sawing wood, pumping water, powering bellows for forges. Windmills, which had been introduced to Europe in the 12th century, became more common and more sophisticated. The mechanical clock, developed in the 14th century, began to appear in public spaces, changing how people measured and organized time. In agriculture, the three-field crop rotation system became more widespread, improving soil fertility and yields. New crops were introduced or became more common: buckwheat, rice in suitable climates, new varieties of vegetables. Viticulture expanded in regions with appropriate climate, producing wine not just for local consumption, but for export. The overall effect of these changes was to make agriculture more productive and more diverse, able to support the population at higher standards of living even as the population itself slowly recovered. In manufacturing, the high cost of labor encouraged investment in tools and techniques that increased productivity. The horizontal treadmill loom, which required only one operator rather than two, became more common in cloth production. In metalworking, improved furnace designs allowed for higher temperatures and better quality iron and steel. Glassmaking techniques improved, producing better window glass and finer glassware. These advances were not revolutionary, but they represented real improvements in productive capacity and quality. The structure of landholding underwent significant changes in many regions. The classic manorial system, with its domain lands worked by the labor services of serfs, declined as landlords found it more practical to rent out land for cash. This process of commutation created a class of tenant farmers who enjoyed considerable autonomy in managing their holdings. The most successful of these tenants accumulated substantial lands, employing wage laborers to work holdings that were too large for a single family to manage. By the early 15th century, a rural middle class was emerging in many parts of England and Western Europe, distinct from both the traditional peasantry and the landed aristocracy. The status of serfs improved dramatically across Western Europe in the century after the plague. Serfdom did not disappear overnight. In some regions it persisted into the 16th century, but it declined steadily as economic forces made it impractical, and as serfs used their leverage to negotiate better terms or simply to walk away. By 1500, serfdom had largely vanished from England and had been greatly reduced in France and the Low Countries. The legally free peasant, holding land by contract rather than by servile obligation, had become the norm in much of Western Europe. Eastern Europe followed a different trajectory. The labor shortage created by the plague led landlords in Poland, Prussia, and other eastern regions to use their political power to bind peasants more tightly to the land, beginning the process that would create the harsh estate agriculture of early modern Eastern Europe. The divergence between Western and Eastern Europe in terms of peasant freedom and agricultural organization, a divergence that would have lasting consequences, can be traced in part to different responses to the common crisis of the plague. The political structures of Europe also evolved in response to the changed circumstances of the post-plague period. The feudal model of governance, based on personal relationships and military service, became less relevant as professional armies replaced feudal levies and as monetary taxation became the primary source of royal revenue. Kings who wanted to wage war or maintain administration needed cash, and obtaining cash required the consent of those being taxed. The result was the expansion of representative institutions, parliaments, estates, courts, diets, that gave propertied subjects a voice in government. These institutions varied greatly in their power and effectiveness. The English Parliament became firmly established as an essential part of governance, with the House of Commons gaining the exclusive right to initiate money bills. The French Estates General met irregularly and never achieved the same permanent role. The Spanish Cortes retained significant power in some kingdoms, while being marginalized in others. The German territorial diets became important at the local level, even as the imperial diet remained weak. Despite this variation, the general trend was toward more complex, more institutionalized governance structures that incorporated some degree of consultation and consent. The development of more sophisticated administrative systems was another consequence of the post-plague period. As governments grew more complex and as monetary taxation became more important, the need for trained administrators increased. Royal courts expanded, staffed by clerks, lawyers, and financial officials, who were often drawn from non-noble backgrounds. These administrators, educated at universities and trained in law and accounting, formed a professional bureaucracy that increasingly supplanted the traditional aristocracy in the actual work of government. The rise of this administrative class, another feature of the transition from medieval to early modern governance, was accelerated by the social mobility made possible by the plague. The relationship between church and state also shifted in the post-plague period. The Great Schism, which divided the church between rival popes from 1378 to 1417, weakened papal authority and strengthened the hand of secular rulers in dealing with the church. Kings and princes gained more control over ecclesiastical appointments and revenues in their territories. The principle of royal supremacy in church matters, which would become explicit during the Reformation, had its roots in the late medieval period when the church's moral authority had been damaged by the plague and the schism. The intellectual ferment of the post-plague period laid groundwork for later developments. The recovery and study of classical texts intensified, driven by humanist scholars who saw in ancient Greek and Roman literature wisdom that had been lost or neglected during the medieval period. Petrarch, who survived the plague, devoted much of his later life to searching for classical manuscripts and promoting the study of ancient languages and literature. His efforts inspired others, creating a movement that would eventually transform European intellectual life. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, emerged from and contributed to the transformations of the post-plague world. Printing was made possible by a combination of factors: the technical skills of metalworkers, the availability of paper, the existence of a literate market for books, and the capital to invest in the expensive equipment and materials required. All of these factors were present in greater measure in the post-plague world than they had been before. The impact of printing on European culture would be profound, making books cheap and abundant, facilitating the spread of ideas, enabling the Reformation and the scientific revolution. By the mid-15th century, Europe had been transformed from what it had been a century earlier. The population, while still below pre-plague levels, was recovering. The economy was more commercialized, with market relationships having replaced many feudal obligations. Social mobility was greater, with more opportunities for advancement based on talent and effort, rather than birth alone. Material living standards for ordinary people were higher than they had been in centuries. Culture was more diverse and more accessible, with vernacular literature and art reaching broader audiences. Education was more widespread, creating a larger literate public. Yet the world remained harsh and uncertain. Life expectancy, while improved from the plague years, was still short by modern standards. Infant mortality remained high. Disease, hunger, and violence continued to claim many lives. The improvements in living standards that the post-plague period brought to Western Europe did not extend equally to all regions or all people. Women remained subordinated to men in law and custom. Jews and other minority groups faced discrimination and persecution. The peasants of Eastern Europe found themselves in worse conditions than before. War, particularly the 100 Years' War between England and France, brought devastation to large areas. The memory of the plague, while fading, remained vivid enough to shape behavior and attitudes. People built churches and endowed masses for the souls of plague victims. They established charities and hospitals to care for the sick. They enacted public health measures, however crude, in attempts to prevent future outbreaks. They created art and literature that grappled with themes of death, suffering, and survival. The plague became part of the cultural inheritance of late medieval Europe, a reference point, a warning, a reminder of fragility and possibility. The century after the Black Death was a period of profound transformation, when a new Europe emerged from the ruins of the old. The changes were not always for the better. Alongside prosperity and opportunity came violence and exploitation. Alongside creativity came destruction. But the overall trajectory was toward a society that was wealthier, more dynamic, more open to change than what had existed before the plague. The world that would give birth to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the age of exploration, and eventually the modern world, was shaped in crucial ways by the century of recovery that followed the greatest catastrophe medieval civilization had known. In a village in England in 1450, a woman named Alice sat by her hearth on a winter evening, her grown children around her, her grandchildren playing at her feet. She had been born in 1441, nearly a century after the plague's first terrible outbreak, and she had known the disease only through the stories her grandmother had told. Stories of villages emptied of cities where the dead outnumbered the living, of a world that had seemed to be ending. But the world had not ended. It had changed, transformed in ways that her grandmother could scarcely have imagined when she huddled in her cottage waiting for death to pass by. Alice lived in a house far more comfortable than the one her great-grandparents had known. Her family ate meat several times a week. Her husband earned wages that allowed them to save money and to plan for the future. Her children were learning to read. The fields around the village produced abundant harvests from soil that had been enriched by years of rest. The church in the village center, rebuilt in the decades after the plague, with funds contributed by prosperous parishioners, was more beautiful than the old one had been. Life was not easy. It never would be, not in this world, but it was better, richer, fuller than it had been for her ancestors. As Alice sat by her fire, she might have reflected on the strange truth that the greatest catastrophe in human memory had also been, in some ways, an opening, a clearing away of old constraints, a redistribution of resources that had made possible the modest prosperity she now enjoyed. She would not have wished the plague on anyone, would have given much to have back the millions who had died, but they were gone, and the living had to make what they could of the world that remained, and that world, for all its harshness and uncertainty, offered possibilities that would have seemed miraculous to the serfs and peasants of the pre-plague era. The renaissance of hope that followed the Black Death was not a simple story of recovery and return to normalcy. It was a story of adaptation and transformation, of a society that could not go back, and so had to go forward into an uncertain future. The Europe that emerged from the plague years was different from what had existed before, more commercial, more mobile, more literate, more questioning of traditional authority. These changes would have consequences that echoed down through the centuries, shaping the modern world in ways both visible and subtle. The plague had killed millions, destroyed families, emptied villages, and brought civilization to the brink of collapse. But it had not destroyed the human capacity for resilience, for adaptation, for hope. The survivors rebuilt their world, but they rebuilt it differently, creating from tragedy the possibility of transformation. The century after the Black Death was a time of mourning and loss, but it was also a time of new beginnings, of opportunities seized, of changes that would have been impossible in the more rigid and crowded world that had existed before the pestilence arrived. In the quiet evenings of the late 15th century, as the sun set over landscapes both familiar and transformed, the people of Europe went about their lives with a mixture of memory and hope, carrying the past but looking toward the future survivors, and descendants of survivors building a new world from the ruins of the old. The plague had taken much, but it had also, paradoxically and terribly, given something. Space to breathe, room to grow, possibilities to imagine, a future that wasn't simply a repetition of the past, but something genuinely new. The bells that rang in the churches of Europe in 1500 rang over a world profoundly different from the one they had rung over in 1347. That earlier world, crowded and constrained, hierarchical and unchanging, had been shattered by the plague. The world of 1500, still healing, but also growing, still bearing scars, but also showing new strength, was the product of a century of recovery and transformation. It was a world built on the graves of millions, but it was also a world where the living had carved out space for hope, for prosperity, for creativity, for change. The renaissance of hope was real, though it was built on a foundation of grief. The post-plague world offered opportunities to the survivors and their descendants that would have been unthinkable before the catastrophe. These opportunities were not distributed equally, and they came at a terrible cost, but they were real nonetheless, and from them would grow the achievements and innovations of the late medieval and early modern periods, the art and literature of the Renaissance, the exploration and discovery of new worlds, the religious reformations and political revolutions, the scientific investigations and technological advances that would eventually create the modern world. The greatest catastrophe in European history had also been, in its strange and terrible way, a catalyst for change, a force that shattered old certainties and created space for new possibilities. The people who lived through the plague years and their descendants who inherited the transformed world did not choose the catastrophe. would not have wished it on themselves or anyone else, but having survived it, they made what they could of the changed circumstances, building lives of surprising richness from the wreckage of the old order. And so the story of the century after the Black Death is not just a story of recovery from catastrophe, but a story of transformation, of a civilization that could not return to what it had been, and so became something new. It is a story of resilience and adaptation, of grief and hope, of an ending that was also a beginning. The world that emerged from the plague years was built on death, but it was also undeniably and importantly alive, growing, changing, creating, hoping, moving forward into a future that those who had died in the plague years would never see, but that their survivors made possible through their courage, their labor, and their refusal to let catastrophe be the final word.